Audre Lorde once said, there are no single issues because we do not live single issue lives. And so I'll be speaking with Noah today about the intersection between economic justice, reproductive justice, and public participation in political life. I'm Ophelia, you know me, Keminsha. I'm a lawyer like you, and feminist. And yeah, I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Great. Thank you for having me today, Ophelia. My name is Noah Mirembe. I am a lawyer as well, and I'm very happy to be here.
Okay. So there's been this conversation that we just had right before we started shooting about kind of elitist conversations that happen around economic justice, about giving women washing machines. And yeah, I mean, let's talk a little bit about this, the way that we conceptualize care work to be something that's a burden for, honestly, well-to-do women, cis women, that we need to kind of alleviate them from, and how that holds us back from, making real progress. What do you think?
Wow, no, that's quite actually an interesting observation and an important conversation to be having, especially because of, just not to be this person, but the post-COVID-19 situation, where a lot of people have had a chance to spend a little bit more time at home than they would, and also have a chance to kind of balance their home life or domestic life with their external life, the life that they tend to live with others at work, in workplaces.
Yeah, that public-private divide that we've been saying doesn't exist.
We tend to think exists.
And now it's actually, we can see how it doesn't exist.
Yes, we can see how it doesn't exist. We can see that even while you're attending a Zoom call, you still have children, right? Like that fact doesn't go away.
And
they must eat. Sometimes you can hide them away and tuck them away, and that means, that, like you've rightly pointed out, delegating such labor to people who are not as higher up ranking on whatever class scale that we are using, or perhaps not doing as well, financially, in terms of financial independence.
Yeah.
And so now we realize that this is not work that simply goes away or that you can completely delegate, that to an extent it always still exists parallel to the life that we are living, right? I think that this has given us such an opportunity for us to reflect on, okay, what does it mean for us to participate? Or what does it mean for the economy to still be running, right? How do we participate and keep the economy running?
Yes.
Knowing very well that both sides of the equation actually matter, actually do need to be catered for.
And you see, the thing is, capitalism, which is what we are really living in, survives on that. It assumes that public-private divide assumes that there is a cishet man who has a cishet wife who is doing that production labor to subsidize this man's life, for him to have his shirts ironed and his clothes, his food made, and then show up for capitalism. And I remember during the lockdown, at some point when I was working from home, when I was working from my home, like where I live alone, realizing the kind of labor that goes into me showing up for capitalism every day. I have to bathe myself, make my meals. There are so many things happen that are not seen until I'm doing them in the same space. And then I realize all these things must happen for me to show up.
Yeah.
And if I was a proper capitalist, I should have gotten a wife who would be doing all these things for me to be able to show up and then be as productive as they expect me to be. And so then realizing that for us to truly see freedom, it's the capitalism that has to go. It can't be we can't patch it up, band-aids here and there and buy washing machine.
Yeah. No, and that's actually interesting, right? Like the point that you end at, the one that says, well, it's a capitalism that has to go. And it's something that I think for a lot of us who are involved in decolonial politics and anti-capitalist work, sometimes the question is, okay, how do we do this? How do we make this thing, when we say go, what do we mean? How do we dismantle something that's structural, something that has existed for centuries, when so many of us are actually already disadvantaged, right? Like the two of us, let's talk about reflecting on the professions that we've chosen among the elite professions that we occupy as lawyers, and thinking about how even for a lawyer, even a female lawyer, having to think about leaving your private space to go and be able to occupy and participate productively in the capitalism requires some kind of imaginative way of undoing. I think that, in terms of feminist practice, one of the ways that I think, one of the tools that's really useful for us in trying to unpack these systems is to think about the ways in which we participate, and then maybe can try to unpack without going into individual responsibility and saying, well, if you do better, then the world will get better.
Stop buying iPhones.
Yeah, not necessarily. That's not necessarily true. The problem may morph into something else. But thinking about what are the ways in which, how do we rethink the ways in which domestic work and family is organized, and in order to be able to, if we are subsidizing, what's the cost of that subsidy, right? If you have a domestic worker, what are the other perks that they're entitled to? Things like holidays, and this is not just for domestic workers, this is also for employees, because I know some lawyers in law firms who work like domestic workers, honestly. They work 12 hours a day.
No days off.
No days off. They take orders while being yelled at. They are grossly underpaid. Probably don't even have health insurance, and so we live. So capitalism can be deceptive in the ways that it names some of these forms of labor. And so when I'm talking about individual ways that we can kind of step into the accountable realm, is thinking about, are we able to pay better? If you're doing it at a domestic level, are you paying better? And if you're doing it at a structural level, what are the ways in which you compare how you value your domestic work versus how you value professional work?
Yeah, but also I think that, and I think Angela Davis has a brilliant solution for this thing. I think that what we need to move towards is the socialization of that labor. We have to, she says that housework is just, it's terrible, it's drudgery, regardless of who is doing it, it's terrible work. Nobody enjoys it. And so what are the ways that what are the forms of socialization of that labor? I know that, of course, because with COVID, it became extremely complicated. Of course, you can't, like childcare, for example, which is something that people have really fought for. It became complicated because you can't send your children off to be taken care of somewhere else. But
it's called boarding school.
Yes, but those are solutions that. I'm not saying that everybody should send their kids to boarding school, but I think everybody should have access to quality childcare. I should be able to have my child in a safe place while I go and participate in the economy, whatever that means. And I think that women have been, like we recently celebrated Women's Day, and realizing that Women's Day came from those roots of women saying, you cannot lock us home to always do housework, but also when we come out, we don't expect to be treated differently. So I think that people have been trying to say all of us deserve to participate in the so-called public life, but we need to be able to do it in a way that doesn't, force us to take on the double, triple shift, to end up doing all this other work to make up for, to show up for this, I think, and then be paid less.
Yes,
know?
Absolutely. I think one of the point that you raise, actually, one of the interesting thoughts that comes to mind is thinking about, contrasting the colonial approaches. I think that's what I'm hearing in what Angela Davis is saying. And obviously, I hate to be those people who are nostalgic about pre-colonial Africa, because there's not such a monolithic thing as one pre-colonial Africa. But it's thinking about how societies were organized before they were. And obviously, every society has had some kind of influence with capitalism, right? The capitalism has always existed in some form.
But not in this.
Not in this consumerist, capitalist kind of train that we're in. But it's thinking about how societies were organized elsewhere when they weren't necessarily as individualistic. The socialization of a lot of this labor, rightfully observed, is something that is best done if you share the labor across the domestic setting is one way, because that's your immediate environment. I think it only makes sense that the people who are sitting here should be the people to clean their space. Because you're sitting here, it's your space. And so it's thinking about the ways in which, as Africans, for instance, and Black Africans living in Africa more especially, is the ways in which we have been dissociated from some of these ways of knowing. And again, it goes back to naming, right? Like the ways in which these labors and practices are named goes a long way in othering them and vilifying them and going like, oh, but that extended family is potentially polygamous and whatnot, you know. And so think about how
sinful.
And sinful, you know. And it's not only othered, it's also vilified, right?
Yeah.
So you're right. Like it's African, it's traditional, and then it's also evil, right? It's not enough that it's their thing, it also has to be a bad thing.
Yeah.
And so think about how we still also then have to incorporate decolonial approaches, especially as African feminists, African people, African queers living in Africa. Then you have to kind of think about how do we unpack some of these ways of living and being, and think about, you know, a house has to be cleaned, it's just a house. A floor has to be cleaned, it's just a floor. You know, every human being has to eat. It's just a process to the food getting there, you know. And so and also the recognition then that we give to that labor, right? Like you rightfully pointed out, you talked about the kind of compensation and people not needing to be underpaid when they do come into participating in public life. But in a situation where you recognize that the person who's staying home with your child is doing just as valuable as a job as your ability to show up, you know, that they're participating in public life.
They also deserve a day when they don't have to do this labor.
Exactly.
They deserve to have that day off the same way you do.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so think about how do we then build this way of understanding into, one, our daily practice, but then also, I think, institutional practices. How do we change the society that we're in and you know, bring these issues to light?
It's interesting that you're talking about decolonization, because I keep wondering, like you said, you don't want to romanticize pre-colonial Africa and be like, oh, we're kings, we're all kings and queens.
No, some of us were digging
territory. But I mean, what does decolonization look like in a world that is hurtling towards like a climate crisis at a rate that is really quite scary if you decide to go into that wormhole? What does it look like to recreate a new world? Because I think that this system is simply unsustainable. Like, it has to fall on itself at some point. And in abolition language, you talk about abolition being about not just dismantling prisons, but also what we build up in its place. So I'm curious, like, what does decolonization look like in a post-pandemic climate crisis-headed world? Because, of course, I think we have done very little to contribute to the climate crisis as Africans, but we are also going to be suffering most of the effects. And I think we're suffering most of the effects already. I wonder if you've thought about what those decolonial practices are that lead us to a world that's better. Like, we can build something that's better.
No, so that's an interesting question that you ask about, like, decolonization and climate change. And you know, I hope more people are really thinking about this in a critical way. And for some of us who are passionate, it may seem like, oh, you know, this by just being emotional about the subject. But Africans and the continent overall hasn't had that much of a contribution directly, you know. We are not as heavily industrialized. We are heavily agricultural continent, some parts of it, and other parts do different parts of trade, right? And so to the extent of like accountability and responsibility, to the extent that we're able to just go back to basic tracing, right? I think that countries in the global north in particular, countries that are heavily industrialized, have a bigger responsibility to play in terms of just meeting the challenge where it's at. When it comes to if you've reaped the biggest economic benefits, then you should meet the biggest economic.
Yeah.
In short, please pay up. You know, I'm being polite, but pay up, because that's where the money has been going, right? When it comes to accountability and reparations on the other side, I think that African people, black people, African people, and people who have had indigenous communities, for instance, need to be thinking. I think for those of us especially, let me go back. I think for those of us who are feminists, right, need to be thinking about the ways in which indigenous communities, and we've had these conversations for a long time. We have entire UN conventions that talk about indigenous communities.
Yes.
So we've been aware of indigenous communities for, you know, years, you know, decades. we're also aware of the fact that a lot of these communities still live very much closely in nature. One of the examples of why the West should be paying up that I think about is, for instance, in the ways of building that we live in. People who live in huts, mud and water with straw, and you can, we're not making these things up, you can go look at history, right? They'll tell you these are called ancient ways of building,
Yes.
or like outdated methods of building. And we have entire schools, institutions. So away from individual responsibility, the fact that these are structural issues, we have entire schools and institutions dedicated to teaching these as practices.
Yeah, I think that's
building.
P1 work actually.
Yeah.
When you're drawing houses,
Yes.
there's a hut and then there's a house.
There's a house. So this is the baby one.
So you can
and
say
then
this
you
one
upgrade.
this is where we were. Now we've upgraded. To
Exactly,
this one.
right? And yet we have now people in other parts of the world, and if you watch these house and design and building shows, you'll see people talking about they talk about cob houses, and people can look this up. They've had this one. They're calling it a cob house. Enyumba yetaka,
now it's
mud
cool.
and water. It's cool. It's winning points for being environmentally.
Yeah, and now they're going to sell it back to us.
Yes.
And say this is an
Along with the
eco-friendly,
technique of
this is
how
an
to make this
eco-friendly
thing.
home, and we're going to have experts come from somewhere to come and teach us,
right?
who have been living in them until like now, how to build those houses.
How to build those houses. And at a structural level, we are not hearing our governments are not responding to things like this. We have governments that are more invested in like an internet shutdown and staying in power when we have to deal with people coming from God knows where and owning indigenous knowledge, right? Owning indigenous ways of doing things. When we haven't thought about, I don't know, regional planning, right? If you're in Ugandan WhatsApp groups, I've referenced a lot of text, so you can clearly tell I'm in a certain bracket of society.
Yeah.
But you'll see a lot of WhatsApp groups are now complaining about the 50 by 100 plots of land that are being sold all over Kampala and how it's causing congestion and whatnot. None of those people is looking at, well, what are the other ways of building community? We have environments in this country, if you look at the northern parts of the country, where families know how to build reasonable spacing. They know how to occupy a piece of land, whether it's a 50 by 100 or whatever, but they know how to live in ways that are environmentally friendly. You don't need a fence, you don't need an air conditioner, or God knows what else.
Yeah.
So there's ways in which there's current indigenous knowledge that's still that's still practiced to this day, that we are still capable of, even as elites, actually moving off our pedestals and saying, wait a minute, if I look around, I see that these people are talking about planting forests. What are the conversations happening locally? What are the conversations happening within the indigenous communities? We don't even know where indigenous organizing is happening.
Yeah.
What are the issues they care about,
Yeah.
I think as Africans, in fact, when it comes to the conversation of climate change, I think we, for the first time in like a long time, we're the experts. We have something where we can stand up and just wear that back cloth and say, you know what? Actually, our ways... No, seriously, for the first time, the curve of
But only if they
development...
listen.
They don't have to listen. We are 1 billion plus people on this continent, Who cares who's listening? We need to listen to each other. And this is where this starts.
Yeah.
How do we look and say, even the current designs, right? Architects have heard of something called like fractals and fractal numbers.
Yes.
It's just a technical term for a certain way of dividing a space and how spaces look and reflect upon each other. And it is patterns of organizing communities, cities, And those are things Africans know. We don't need to be talking to someone else. We need to be talking to each other.
We don't need to attend a class.
No. We don't need to go to that conference that takes 18 hours to fly to.
Yeah,
There's no way
and then burns how much on the way.
Burns how much on the way, when we can talk to the neighbors, we can talk to the people in West Africa who've been doing these things. We can talk to the people in Southern Africa who have knowledge on how to preserve, how to build out of stone, And so decolonization is very much a conversation that we as Africans need to be centering in our politics, especially in public life, because I think this is a critical time when for us as a race, we can come together and say, this is a contribution we can give back to other human beings. Yeah, we can take charge of this.
Yeah. I mean, this climate change conversation always makes me think of, because when they say climate change, then they go into now adaptation. I don't know what the other words are, and then they go into, so who are the people who are most affected? And usually they talk about like mothers, people who have to provide food for their family, like the primary agriculture people are the ones who are suffering the brunt of it. And of course, that makes me think about like reproductive justice, because it's a very strange thing where some of us like are fighting for like the right to an abortion. Like it's my private right for me as me. I should be able to walk into a hospital and ask for an abortion and get it. Important.
Rightfully so.
Very important. But also on the other hand, you also have conversations where people say that poor people should not be having children. Yeah? So for me it's a right, but for other than it's a duty. Like it's your duty to bring another child into this world because you can't afford it. And why can't she afford it? I mean, regardless of beyond whether or not she wants one, why can't she afford it in the first place? So what are the, I think that this sexual rights conversation, reproductive rights conversation is often around like services, like birth control pills, abortion, the nitty-gritty, and not about just the entire structure of reproductive justice. Like the right to be able to decide when you want to get pregnant, if you can get pregnant, the right to be able to control how many children you have, and then to decide how many you want to have, but also to be able to live in an environment where you can provide for them and raise them in a way that you feel comfortable with, because I think that's all part of, pushing the baby out is just like the beginning of having to keep this human being alive. And I wonder how you think about what's some of the things that we can build, the ways that we can move the reproductive justice conversation forward beyond rights. Beyond like the right to one thing, right to privacy, right to I'm wondering what are the other things that we can think about, but also what are the things that we can learn from us queers, from LGBT communities who are usually like this other add-on, So SRHR is for cis-het women who want abortions, and then plus,
so accurate.
Plus also men who have sex with men, or what they call key populations. That's the language.
That's the language.
Like what are the things that you're thinking about in this reproductive justice arena?
Oh wow. Reproductive justice is such a rich entry point into economic justice. So it's so,
the things are connected.
Yeah, they're so connected, and I like how you've weaved it. I like how you've weaved it together. Just talking about the distinction between the rights on one side. It's one thing for you to have the right, and another thing for you to be told you have the duty to now participate in the public and the economy in a certain way and to contribute to.
And also not to burden the rest of us. They're like, us, we're paying taxes. Those poor people don't pay taxes. But they have so many children.
We're burdening the poor people.
And it's not fair.
We're burdening the poor people because they're the majority, right?
Yeah.
We the elites.
And they're not giving us the food that we eat.
Exactly. They're doing the hardest labor. They're growing that food. I mean, a lot of us own 50 by 100s, 100 by 100 marks.
With our
fence. I have to put my papers in there so that people know that, I don't live in a muddy area.
Yeah.
So I'm not even growing my own, even a tomato.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Spring onions, nothing.
Not even a spring onion, for crying out loud. I mean, it's grass. It could just grow on a windowsill. We're not even doing the least amount of contribution to life, really. Let's just say life, because some of us are not,
most important thing.
Some of us are not even giving birth because we're busy chasing our careers. I mean, if you think of it that way, then maybe.
Yeah, and that's why I want the birth control. We're saying I want birth control so that I don't have to
think about it.
Raise children, but also I don't want to do any contribution towards making that accessible to everybody in a way that's not dehumanizing. That's not all of you have, get these implants because you're poor women and you have to, like that line between, and that, that explains some of the misgivings that people have about birth control, because eugenics, like black women all over the world have been sterilized or forced into birth control because of just like race and class, and thinking like poor people don't deserve to have children, or poor people have too many children. And then there are these adverts that you've seen of like the happy family has 2 children, and then the unhappy family has like 10, and the kids are crying and they have nothing to eat. But without the critical analysis of why, what is the system that has led to this situation, that's not just, like you said, individual responsibility.
It's quite. I think Sylvia Tamale's most recent book has a quite an interesting chapter that unpacks this particular question. I think that chapter was one about gender equality. The book is Decolonization and Afrofeminism.
Excellent book.
Highly recommended. Brief marketing. I worked with her on like the research part of it, so that was like just a revisiting a class, a restudy on just the entire subject, right, of how decolonization is and what we're thinking about Afrofeminism. Anyway, highly recommended for a chapter on the limitation of rights, right, and how the individual guarantees and liberties that we've been promised under, liberal politics, and the promise of individuality and thriving hasn't always been achieved because these rights are limited in terms of their application, right? One of the ways, this goes back again, not to take you back to the decolonization conversation, but one of the ways that she ties, let's throw that one. One of the ways that she ties the limitations of individual rights is in the origin of human rights. Is looking at how human rights principles emerged out of just economic negotiations, essentially, the Magna Carta, and having people in the UK having to negotiate, the elites having to negotiate freedom or liberty from the monarchy, right? And having to distinguish between what powers the monarch, the state, and the king has over you versus the power that you as a propertied man.
Yes, usually white man.
It was a white man, right? At that point, what a propertied man is entitled to. And she was looking at the limitations of being able to translate the rights that a propertied white man is entitled to, and really stretching that cloth to say it covers a black woman.
We're just like pulling trying to cover ourselves,
and hoping, that those rights as declared will somehow mean something to you who has no property, you're not anywhere on that you're quite below the class chain, and the ability to exercise those rights, right? Because the rights don't exist in a vacuum. There has to be awareness of those rights. And even if you're aware of them, then you have to have the means to exercise those rights. Literally the means. For instance, having a right to an abortion, even on paper, when the nearest clinic is 10 kilometers away.
Doesn't mean anything.
Like, okay, then what am I supposed to do? There's no public transport. I live in a remote area where electricity rarely shows up. Okay, so the doctor can give me an abortion, but how will I get there? And even if I get there, there'll probably be no doctor. So just the ways in which, how can we begin to unpack, those deeper structural issues, I think requires deliberate, conscious thinking to say, okay, just these rights don't exist in a vacuum. What does access really mean on a practical level? I'll give you an example. Part of what we're chatting about before this conversation started around trans women and how they're included in SRHR conversations. So over the years, as the issue of rights has grown, one of the most, progressive things, the progressive areas of work that we've been able to push towards has been autonomy, bodily autonomy, and women's ability to be able to access reproductive services and information when they have it. The challenge with this has been in how we are framing who these women are. Obviously we're thinking about the elite woman who can fly to the abortion because she has that right. She's cisgender, she knows what's happening and she's ready. Versus all the other women, right? And the ways in which, looking at the history of the invention of women, Professor, I was looking at the Professor talks about that. Looking at the history of the invention of women, certain women are not going to fit that definition or category of woman. And not just an African woman, but really if you're a black person and if you're a black woman, the category woman, that's not you. We're not talking about the rights man, that's not you, and we're not talking about woman, that's definitely not you. So now black woman, and also if you're a black trans woman, where do you belong? How do you begin to find your place in a society that hasn't been thinking about you? One of the criteria that trans people have within not just the law, but sometimes in practice, because in some places like Uganda, the law is a bit vague. I say this because on paper, the Constitution will say you have all these rights, but the cloth of rights is not very elastic.
Not enough.
So it's not enough elastic in there. And so you're told in practice, so when the Constitution will say that, and then in practice when you're trying to live your identity and exercise just your life, a lot of trans people are told that in order to have access to recognition, and what do I mean by because you are, like just you are, you don't need to be recognized. But by recognition I mean an ID, anything that will enable you get a mobile money line, get a phone, banang, so that you can talk to other Ugandans.
And a farming kind.
Bank account. A bank account. A bank account you're asking for too much, because bank account is usually if you're expecting recurring payments, right? And that's a job. In order to get that level of recognition, you need to convince somebody that you're real. And our society has decided that you only do that by how you look. Right?
And that you are who you say you are.
And that you are who you say you are. And so for a lot of trans people, in order to access recognition legally, at least on a systemic level, you need to, it's directly tied to your access to bodily autonomy and reproductive being. And why do I say this? Someone would be required to have part of a transition, whether or not it's medically required. So trans is an umbrella. Bodily expression is an umbrella. A lot of people do express differently. You don't have to identify either way. You express the way you express. Now, in the same way that poor women are forced into sterilization, is the same way that a lot of trans people are forced into sterilization. Is that people are going to tell you, well, you need to go onto hormones. You need to transition. And a physical transition basically means either surgery
or both.
or both. And to ask somebody to do that, you're asking them to make a choice around, it's basically a reproductive choice is what you're asking them to do. Although most people actually don't consider that. They'll say, oh, yeah, but how will we know that they are who they say they are if they haven't transitioned? I'm like, but you do realize you're asking somebody to give up a part of their body, right, in order to be seen as real, in order to be recognized as...
for you to recognize them as who they say
they are, right? And so there are all these, those are structural barriers that we're building into people being able to access their identities. And so for a lot of people, they won't take those steps. And that obviously comes with a lot of other criteria. Do you have the right information? Do you even know that you have this?
Correspond with the person who has shown
information? Do you know where you're going to go? And etc. And so for a lot of people who haven't had that level of either education or exposure, which is 90%, most
at the beginning they are being treated poorly.
Exactly. And therefore they're not able to, so now they're not able to exercise bodily autonomy, and that directly links with them being able to exercise economic autonomy, because now I can't get a job, or if I go into a job and an environment with work, then I'm treated with suspicion because they're like, okay, you don't have papers. All the papers you have, don't
correspond.
They don't correspond.
The person who has shown up.
Exactly. So whose things are these? And so for people like that, people who are at that level of the margins, reproductive justice and bodily autonomy becomes the centerpiece for them beginning to even talk about occupying public life. So when a lot of people are like, oh yeah, we don't know transport, we've never seen a trans person. Well, of course you've never seen a trans person. Like, of course you've never met one. We're not in employment, we're not in your jobs for a lot of reasons, right? It's not because they don't exist.
And even the ones who are there are probably not visible. They're too afraid to show up as themselves.
Exactly, right? And so thinking about like issues of bodily autonomy are really, really then central. And that's just one example for one group of people, right? When you talk about cis hetero women, there's an entire list. And I think to the extent that society doesn't know much about trans people, sometimes it can be an advantage, because then it means you're not burdened with the expectations and etc., right? And then you, when you come to cis women, then you have to feel empathy for cis women, because society has now spent a lot of time investing in the criteria for which they can access economic well-being. Is that, oh no, in order for you to be you have to be a kept woman. In order for you to have access to dignity as a woman, as a human being, yeah. Leave the Bill of Rights alone.
Yes.
As a person who breathes air and walks through society, right? Before I interface with the state and systems, is that I have to be spoken for. I have to be someone's wife. I have to be someone's daughter, someone's sister.
I mean, there are many scenarios of people going to get reproductive things done, and they have to get their husband to come with them. Absolutely. They have to get their husband's permission to get certain things, and it puts them in this awkward position where they have to consult, and it's assumed that you have to do it. And I know a story of a single friend of mine who went and tried to get birth control, and they told her, "But you're not married, so what do you know?" So then, yeah, like that. Yeah, it's really systemic and structural, and but it's interesting you're talking about the margins, because I think that's what intersectionality gives us. Yeah, that the freedom comes from the margins, not from the center. Yeah. And if you conceptualize rights and reproductive justice and whatever from like a kept Christian, cisgender, heterosexual woman's perspective, then you miss a lot of people get thrown off the bus like that. And yet if you started from the margins, if you started from the most marginalized, what's accessible to them would automatically be accessible to this one. Yeah. You know, if a trans person can walk into a hospital and get what they need, that means that definitely a cisgender woman can walk into it and get what they need. But we keep kind of organizing around the center, around ourselves actually, and not like looking to the other side, because those are the people who have the most clear idea of what the problem is and probably even the best solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you entirely. I think that for organizations, especially now for organizations, right, to the extent that you can, like, who are you centering? That's always a first question. I hope the last 1 year has given people a chance to reflect, just because you didn't have to be rushing anywhere all the time. So I hope people really had a chance to ask some really hard questions. And this is one of those questions. Who does your work center? Because it's easy to miss it. It's really quite easy. It's only until I started directly working with like trans people, lesbian women in SRHR, sexual and reproductive health and rights, that I realized how many issues they still were.
Yeah.
But no, that's not what's happening. Actually, another example, drawing off the example that you are pointing out about how we need to center people who are not who are on the margins and think about how these issues affect them. I have this friend who's identifies as she's a bisexual woman. In her earlier years, she had a child with her male cisgender partner. She's a single mom. She raises the child perfectly fine. This is Ugandan society, so we are all aware of how many people tend not to take responsibility or not step up in the ways that they should when these are all their offspring, right? When she tried to, later on in her later years, I mean, her child is relatively grown now, she tried to have another baby. And this time she was thinking, I should just try and do this on my own. I've already raised one child on my own. I can do this, I know I can do this. And so she went around to different fertility clinics in the country trying to access reproductive services, and literally had, first of all, half the doctors she met were men, yeah,
of course,
older men,
yes,
yeah, and half, I think all of them asked her to come in with a male partner,
yeah,
if she's interested.
They thought she was unhinged. They were like, there is no way. Lone woman.
Never mind that she's already a lone woman raising a child. In the patriarchy and the heterosexuality that has been framed around, supposed to have been successful, it wasn't.
Yeah.
That someone wants to be able to exercise that choice shouldn't be, a matter of public uproar, especially if the people are going to provide a loving home for this child. Yeah.
And that's where like queer communities have so much to teach us about what a loving home is, because the loving home is a man, woman, father, mother, and 2 children. And yet, like you were saying, since we, as Africans, we don't fit into that bill. Just as Africans, that extended family is just family to us. That's just, everybody says, yeah, I grew up with my cousin. That's my cousin, but they're like my sister. And like for us, those are different structures. But instead of trying to go back to them, like you were saying, to decolonize, we are now trying to move away from them.
Actually, interesting story.
In the opposite direction.
When you're Chief Justice, you need to change this. Yeah, we know when you're Chief Justice. Recently, I was attending to court, the High Court. No, I was in the Chief Magistrate's Court, and it was a series of. It looked like they were doing mentions of the cases, just criminal cases. It was a criminal session, and the magistrate had to let the suspects know how long, where the cases are at, how long investigations are taking, etc., etc. One of the things that struck out to me that comes to this conversation was during the bail, because some people were able to apply for bail at that point. Some people were not represented, so they'd put up their hands and they'd address the magistrate about wanting to apply for bail. And a few, maybe 2, 3 of the people who were in the room, the magistrate would ask, well, what's your relationship to this person? And the person would say, because some of them were speaking Luganda, and they needed a translator. So the person would say, Oyo muwala wange. So it's 2 older men or somebody. So, okay, who are you? And this person is a surety. So the person responding is the surety. The magistrate is asking them how they know the suspect.
Yeah.
And so the person, the surety is responding to say, no, this is muwala wange, which loose translated would be
my daughter.
Yeah, my daughter. And so the magistrate then I think for some of the 2 clients that first left, the question wasn't re-emphasized, but I think at some point she picked up on muwala wa wadala, like, is she really your daughter?
Yeah.
And the client responded, muwala wa abawa muganda wange. So this is my brother's daughter, or this is my sister's.
Yeah.
And to say, yeah, but this is my daughter.
Yeah.
I mean, this person is in court
Yeah.
with a criminal, suspected criminal. So by the time I show up and I say this is family, they are a family. And the magistrate would respond and say, oh, Simuwala, that's not your daughter. That's your niece.
But it is.
No, she would say, no, that's your niece. And they cross-cancel it and write it. So I thought, and I've seen lawyers talking about this, how do we decolonize institutions like a courtroom? Which is why I think, having a Chief Justice who has thought about this for years.
You're giving me a very difficult job. That means it's time for us to wrap up. So maybe as we wrap up, I guess for me, my final thoughts around this intersectionality thing is that, like Audre Lorde said, we don't live single issue lives. Everything is connected. That sounds, I really sound like one of those witches. Everything is connected. The land, the air.
No, but it is.
But everything is connected. And it's interesting how we started with economic justice and went into climate crisis and went into reproductive justice and have ended up somewhere in the extended family. Because I think that living in the patriarchy as we do as a transgender man, as a cisgender woman, you experience all these things at once. It's not like today is climate crisis problem, and then tomorrow I'm dealing with a reproductive justice problem. Like, we experience them at once, and I think that like having wholesale solutions that kind of put everything in play is really helpful, because then I think those are solutions that can be like sustainable. So, any last thoughts?
Oh, that was such a great wrap up. I'm so afraid to jump up.
I trust you.
It was very well weaved together. No, I think you're absolutely right. Audre Lorde is a fountain of wisdom, so she can't be wrong. She can't be wrong.
Not about this.
Not about this, at least. Yeah. No, we don't live single issue lives, rightfully so. And if anything is clear today, if anybody is paying attention, honestly, if anything is clear today, it's that these issues are interconnected. The fact that fires are just sparking off in the middle of Australia and California and Texas freezing over, there are lots of places where people do recognize that climate change is directly linked with our ability to survive. And by survival, I don't just mean like make money, but really survive.
Like
and
to literally be able to live.
We're not going to be able
in
to
the
grow
world.
food, people.
Yeah.
Seasons have changed, and farmers have been talking about this for a long time. And to think that people who live in rural areas still have to contend with walking 10 kilometers to access that right that we have in the Bill of Rights is ridiculous, right? You know, and so if I think about decolonization, I think is think about how do we recenter people and grassroots and communities.
And not capital.
And not capital. Capital can be a result. Yeah, and I've come to a point where I'm like, okay, fine. If we have to live with this thing called capital, it's a bad marriage. How do we make it bearable? Not even work, maybe, but like, how do we coexist with this thing without having it kill and destroy? Because it's only reproducing destruction. So how do we make it less destructive? If that's a thing, because I don't know if capitalism is capable of
I
being
guess
less
we'll have to try and then see and then be like, maybe it's
but
there.
grassroots, going back to the grassroots and centering and finding the ways in which those communities are doing things differently and making that the center of how we honestly don't. And I know we say this like when we mean well, we don't need as many material things as we have. Yeah. And so just how can we recenter those ways, rethink and recenter those ways of knowing and being, I think would go a long way in just helping us see a better, a more economically just world. Because people making good choices individually, I think,
doesn't go far. Like,
yeah,
I don't think it's enough. Okay. Well, this was nice.
It was nice. Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Ophelia. It's very good chatting with you about these very many issues.